It's great to see you all here. Thank you all for joining and for being such an attentive and active audience as well. Your questions are great, so keep them coming. Either feel free to stop me at any point, or we can take them all at the end. Whatever works. So just a really quick introduction. My name is Matt Korda. I'm a senior research associate for the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists. And so the goal of that project is to really try and pull back the curtain on nuclear secrecy and to empower the public with factual information about nuclear weapons, nuclear weapons policy, trends, operations, all of those sorts of things, in order to challenge assumptions and to improve public accountability of government officials. And so in the interests of global nuclear transparency, our goal is to produce the best non-classified estimates of global nuclear arsenals and trends by analyzing information from a really wide variety of open sources like satellite imagery, budget documents, treaty documents, statements, all of that sorts of thing. So those estimates that Caesar showed in his presentation, those for the most part come from us here at FAS. And so I'm happy to talk a little bit more if folks have questions about how those estimates get made, what goes into them, where we find our information. So that's a fun and interesting topic as well. But I've been asked at this point to speak about the relationship between Canada and NATO and collective nuclear security. So we can kind of go ahead and dive into that. NATO has effectively been a nuclear alliance since its founding in 1949, right? By that time, the atomic age was already, it was 4 years old. The US had already used 2 nuclear weapons in combat in 1945, and the Soviet Union was only months away from detonating their first atomic bombs. And from the very beginning, really, NATO, led by the United States, viewed nuclear weapons as the means to defend Europe against the conventional superiority of the Soviet Red Army. And so with that in mind, the United States forward deployed what are known as tactical nuclear weapons, right? These kind of lower yield battlefield use nuclear weapons to Europe in the early 1950s. And the goals of that policy were twofold, right? So first was for a perceived military utility, right? The idea being that they would be used at the very outset of a conflict in order to stall a rapid Soviet advance. The second and more understated, and in my opinion, quite interesting goal was to prevent the United States' NATO allies from getting nuclear weapons of their own, right? The idea being that if they had direct access to US nuclear weapons, then they would be less inclined to develop their own. And so these two goals have really been at the core of NATO's nuclear sharing policies ever since. And we'll talk a little bit about how they've evolved and most importantly, whether or not they're still relevant today. So we're gonna go back to Menti really quick and see how well folks were listening during Caesar's presentation, because he somewhat preempted my question a little bit. But as we know, during the Cold War, the United States deployed nuclear weapons in quite a few NATO countries outside of its own territory. And so I'd like you to select, there should be a big list here if you go to menti.com and use the code 77846247, in which NATO countries you think have ever hosted US nuclear weapons. So not necessarily which ones are still hosting it today. Quite a few of these countries are still hosting them today, but not all of them. And there were, other countries that the US hosted weapons in throughout the Cold War. So I'll take a minute here, and I have up here all 30 members of NATO currently, which do not include the 2 incoming ones, it seems. All right, we've got some answers here. I'll wait a little bit longer. Let's see if we can, with all these collective answers, get to some of the right ones. This is good. All right, so I'll keep on going and let the answers trickle in. So this is really interesting, actually. So what we're seeing is, there's a really wide variety of countries that have been selected here. In reality, the US stored nuclear weapons in 8 countries in NATO during the Cold War. So, but there's a big mix here as to which ones, kind of got pulled up. But the ones that have gotten the most answers, I think, are correct. So Belgium has hosted US nuclear weapons and still hosts them today. Germany as well, still hosts them today. Turkey, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but Turkey still hosts nuclear weapons today, as does the Netherlands, which got 4 votes. The UK, which got 4 votes. The UK no longer hosts them, but we will also talk a little bit about how that might be changing over the coming years. What else did I miss? Greece did host US nuclear weapons for quite some time, but pulled out of the nuclear sharing mission in the early 2000s. And it's interesting to see here, both France and the UK get quite a number of votes. So I mentioned the UK, the US hosted nuclear weapons in the UK for quite some time. It stopped in 2008, but the UK has its own independent nuclear deterrent, as does France, which kind of operate in a somewhat different role within the NATO structure than how the United States does. So we can talk about that as well. And Canada. Canada has 5 votes. Canada did host between 250 and 450 US nuclear weapons on and off from about 1950 until 1984, mostly at Goose Bay Air Force Base in Labrador, but also at bases in Quebec and in Ontario. And those nuclear weapons began to be removed from Canadian soil beginning in around 1968 due to largely public and also government opposition in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis. That process of removing them took quite a long time, and they kind of moved around between bases, but the last US nuclear weapons in Canada left Canadian soil in 1984. So it's important to note also that these US warheads were never in the sole possession of Canadian personnel, right? They were the property of the US government, and they were always under the direct supervision of what was called a custodial detachment from the US Air Force. And those are kind of still the terms that we hear today in Europe. And that's really emblematic of how the United States shared its nuclear weapons with its NATO allies, right? Given that the US was deploying these weapons outside of its own territory, and currently is still the only nuclear power to deploy nuclear weapons outside of its own territory, which might be changing with Russia maybe sharing nukes with Belarus, but that's a whole other story. The US had to navigate this really complex series of political arrangements in order to determine who would actually be in control of these weapons, right? The United States or the European host countries. And so between 1952 and 1968, the US concluded about like 70 or 80 individual nuclear agreements between the US and all of these different NATO countries where they hosted nuclear weapons. And in each case, what it boiled down to is that the nuclear weapons were under direct control of the United States. However, the president could effectively release the weapons to be delivered by the aircraft of those host countries at the outset of a conflict. And some countries, including countries like West Germany, they openly advocated for much more direct control over the employment of US nuclear weapons based on their territory as an assurance against a Soviet invasion. And it's really interesting because they used really actively this threat of nuclear proliferation, right? Getting their own nuclear weapons to jockey for more control. And so when you look at the historical record, you can see this really, really interesting kind of political tug of war that's playing out between US leaders and West German leaders, where you're seeing the German chancellors at the time basically kind of saying, unless you give us more control over your nuclear weapons, maybe we'll think about getting our own nuclear deterrent, right? And they do this for like several decades, right? It's a really, really interesting political dynamics. I wrote my dissertation on it. It's really, really, really fascinating. So ultimately, the negotiations settled into kind of a more formalized structure, which are the nuclear sharing arrangements that we see within NATO today. And currently, every NATO ally, with the exception of France, participates in what's called the Nuclear Planning Group within NATO, and that body directs NATO's nuclear posture. Some of those countries continue to host nuclear weapons, right? So we mentioned, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Italy, right? But others participate in the nuclear mission through what is called SNOCAT operations, which is a great acronym that stands for Support of Nuclear Operations with Conventional Air Tactics, SNOCAT. And it allows countries that don't host nuclear weapons in NATO to use their military aircraft to provide close air support to the planes that actually drop nuclear weapons in a conflict. So you have the planes that are actually, holding the gravity bombs, and then you have conventional aircraft flying next to them, providing air support from countries that don't host nuclear weapons. So it's NATO's way of kind of expanding the nuclear sharing mission a little bit without formally expanding the number of nuclear weapons that are spread across NATO. So we can do another.
Matt, if I could jump in with a quick question, because I think it's something I've wondered before, and it would be different, I'm assuming, for each state, obviously, but for a state that does not possess nuclear weapons, what is the incentive to host them on their territory?
Oh, great question. So this is really interesting, because you can see it playing out right now in a country like Poland, right? So Poland currently does not host US nuclear weapons, but they are quite openly advocating to host US nuclear weapons on their territory. And they've, their government officials have written articles and things like that, publishing them in major US newspapers saying, if the US wants to expand its nuclear mission, like, we will take them. And I think the idea behind it is that, and we'll go into this a little bit later, is that these nuclear gravity bombs that are deployed in Europe have a very limited military utility, right? Like, relative to everything else that's in the US nuclear arsenal, they are basically not actually that useful. But they function, in effect, as some kind of military assurance, or even, some countries will think of it as like a tripwire, right? To the effect that if a conflict breaks out in Europe, having US nuclear weapons there is a signal that says the US will defend Europe with nuclear weapons at the outset of a conflict. And if the idea being that if they didn't have those nuclear weapons there, then the US might be more reluctant to do so. That's kind of the reasoning behind why some of these countries really advocate for keeping those nuclear weapons on their territory. You can make a lot of questions about whether or not those assurances could be achieved in other ways, despite that are not just deploying US nuclear weapons there. Could they be achieved through political statements, through sanctions, like basically what the United States is doing right now, right? Doing everything but getting involved in a shooting war, right, with Russian troops. Is that enough of an assurance, or do they really need those gravity bombs in Europe? And a lot of people will disagree over that, and we'll go into that a little bit later. But it's a really interesting question. Does that answer it? I can keep going.
It did for me. Very succinct. Thank you so much, Matt.
Cool. Okay, so another quick Menti exercise. So I forgot to hit enter, but there you go. Though you can see the answers there. Is it going to the next one? Hey, there we go. Okay. I might have just given away the answer there. All right, hopefully no one was looking. But so my next question is, with Canada and Greece and the UK no longer hosting US nuclear weapons, there are 5 NATO countries that still host them, right? We saw them before: Belgium, Italy, Germany, Netherlands, Turkey. And I'd like you to throw out here in this Menti poll a total number of weapons that you think still remain in Europe. And while you do that, I'm just going to point out this picture that you can see also as part of this poll, right? This is one of the air bases in Italy that hosts US nuclear weapons. And this is, you can kind of just see like a bit of a layout here for how this works. And this is kind of a standardized layout within all of these different air bases, right? So you have the runway, you can kind of see the runway there. All of those red dots are what are called PASs, protective aircraft shelters. And that's kind of these hardened bunkers where the aircraft live. And then you have in this kind of red kind of perimeter area, that is the weapons storage area, right? So that's where it has extra security, it'll have more fencing, and that is really where the US custodial detachment will function within this airbase, because this airbase is in Italy, right? There's airbases just like it in the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, right? Turkey. But the US detachment kind of stays within that weapon storage area because that's kind of their particular territory within this airbase. And then the warheads get paired with their planes in the event of a conflict. So, all right, so taking a look at the answers, we have a big kind of critical mass on 200. It actually is closer to 100 at this point. It at least based on our best estimates from what we can tell, and you know, we have kind of heard from various government folks that the number has kind of been trickling down over the years. It used to be somewhere closer to 150 a few years ago. It seems that now it's closer to around 100. We don't really have a great sense of how those 100-ish are distributed amongst those air bases, but we get the sense that it's somewhere between 15 and 20 within each base or so. Although that's, you know, can change, and that's certainly not a, you know, extremely high confidence estimate. But just to give you a sense of how much that number has dwindled, you know, in the mid 1970s, the US had almost 7,000 nuclear warheads in Europe across 145 storage sites, right? And now we're down to 100, but there is not really a huge indication that that number is going to get much lower than 100 anytime soon. And we'll talk about why, and we'll talk about maybe how that can change. So that's it for Menti right now. But so, oh yeah, Matthew, go for it.
Thanks. I was just wondering, also in terms of Canada being part of NORAD, do we host any like additional nuclear weapons in terms of like that strategic alliance, or is it pretty much even to our NATO commitment?
Yeah, it's a great question. So with NORAD, you know, there are radar systems and things like that that are hosted by Canada that kind of fall under the NORAD structure. But we no longer host nuclear weapons. That was all done through the NATO, kind of the NATO structure, which ended in the 80s. So NORAD, you know, there are a lot of, the big questions about NORAD right now are about, you know, modernization of the radar systems and things like that, which, you know, are kind of older Cold War systems. And, you know, there has been a kind of revitalization of this big controversial question about Canada and its role in US missile defense. And that kind of falls under more of the NORAD structure because that's more of a North American thing. But on the nuclear weapons side, that was entirely kind of through this more NATO structure, if that makes sense.
Okay. That's a relief. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. So just kind of returning to those two, you know, fundamental goals that NATO nuclear sharing was, you know, intended to do, right? Preventing war and preventing proliferation. And the big kind of question is, you know, in the year 2022, is nuclear sharing still contributing towards either of those goals? And in the case of the first goal, right, this kind of the idea of complicating Russian strategic planning and preventing war, it's a really highly debated topic right now, right? Critics suggest that nuclear sharing, you know, on the one hand, didn't prevent Russia from, you know, annexing Crimea in 2014 or invading Ukraine in 2022. And so those weapons didn't really appear to deter Russian behavior at all. It is worth noting, though, that Ukraine is not in NATO. Ukraine didn't possess nuclear weapons at the outset of the conflict, and perhaps the dynamics would change if either of those things were true. You know, others also suggest that nuclear sharing could be working to prevent the conflict in Ukraine from escalating from the conventional realm to the nuclear realm, and you know, bringing in NATO or the United States a little bit more. That being said, you know, it's my understanding that Russian war planning looks at the complete US and NATO military posture, not just those 100 gravity bombs that are, you know, sitting in those bases. And I would assume that the reason why, you know, the war hasn't escalated significantly is not just because, you know, of those 100 bombs, but much more to do with, you know, the other 3,600 nuclear weapons that are in the US military stockpile, right? So as I mentioned before, you know, in responding to Kelsey's question, I would suggest that those 100 gravity bombs in Europe have very little actual military utility but play really a symbolic role in as much as the Allies understand it, in assuring that the US will come to their aid in the event of a nuclear conflict. And then, but of course, the big question is that symbolism worth the political and financial cost of actually deploying them? And could those US assurances be broadcast in other ways beyond a physical deployment of nuclear weapons? And so we can go to the second goal, which is preventing NATO allies from developing their own nuclear weapons. We have actually seen in recent years, it's been interesting to see that some individual politicians, especially during the Trump era, kind of advocated for their country to kind of go their own way and develop nuclear weapons of their own. It was especially prominent in Germany. And also in Turkey, President Erdogan said some things along those lines, but this was really a big thing in Germany where it kind of made headlines. But from my perspective, that is not really at all realistic. Not only would countries face a lot of really big challenges, right? Just inherent technological and logistical challenges, but they would also have to do it in complete secret, or else face certain and very swift political retaliation from the largely very anti-nuclear sentiments of European constituents. Which brings me to another important factor, right? Public opinion about US nuclear weapons in Europe is very low, right? In 2018, ICAN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, conducted this poll in 4 countries that host US nuclear weapons: Belgium, Germany, Netherlands, and Italy. And they asked whether or not participants believed that the weapons should stay or be removed. And the results were overwhelmingly in favor of the weapons being removed. It was somewhere between like 57% to 70% in all 4 countries. And the level of approval for actually keeping them there was very low, somewhere in the realm of like 15 to 20%. So it's really clear that public opinion in Europe is very much against retaining US nuclear weapons on European soil. And it's at the moment quite unclear whether or not the TPNW is going to have an effect on the status of NATO's nuclear posture, and specifically the forward deployment of those weapons on NATO European territory. But we're already seeing that some host countries are reacting to that and are thinking about ways to actually remove those nuclear weapons. So in January 2020, in Belgium, the Belgian parliament had a bill that was very narrowly defeated. It was 74 to 66 in the Belgian parliament. That the bill was to basically draw up a roadmap to withdraw US nuclear weapons from Belgian soil. And that was a very narrowly defeated amendment, right? So it's entirely possible that the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons could spur similar types of resolutions in either Belgium or in other countries, which is probably why the United States tried so hard to get countries to withdraw their ratifications to the treaty. And I guess, so just kind of, wrapping up a couple things here. With all of this said, I guess like critics of nuclear sharing would argue that then from a war prevention standpoint, a proliferation prevention standpoint, and from a democratic standpoint, the deployment of US nuclear weapons in Europe no longer makes much sense. And in addition, there are some pretty serious questions about the security of those weapons that are being deployed outside the United States. So I mentioned Turkey earlier. During the coup in Turkey in 2016, government forces cut power to the airbase that hosts US nuclear weapons for over 5 days, right? Effectively locking US forces out of their own base and effectively holding the nuclear weapons hostage, right? They were just there. No one could get in or out. It was really dangerous, right? For I think pretty obvious reasons. And so a lot of people, including both inside and outside the government, we talk to folks here in the US government all the time, and a lot of people are really uncomfortable with having US nuclear weapons in Turkey. And so a lot of folks have been advocating to kind of quietly remove them for years. And then one last kind of interesting little security tidbit is that, in this past year, I don't know how many folks are familiar with Bellingcat, but they're an open source research unit, based in the UK. And they discovered that US Air Force officers in Europe were using basically public flashcard sites to study for their nuclear weapons maintenance exams, and thus in exposing very sensitive details about how the weapons were stored, what the passcodes are, you know, what security catchphrases you're supposed to say to identify intruders and things like that, were all just posted online in public forums. And so like, you know, there's some really big questions about how secure are these weapons that are being hosted outside of US territory. And I guess, you know, the problematic thing is, despite all of these concerns, the US and NATO are currently upgrading all of the existing nuclear weapons storage sites in Europe. They're preparing them to receive the latest iteration of the US gravity bomb, which is the B61-12. And you know, additionally, my colleague here in DC, Hans Christensen, recently noticed in a budget document that the US is also upgrading its nuclear storage site in the UK, which could potentially indicate a return to hosting US nuclear weapons in England for the first time since they were withdrawn in 2008. So we could really start to see, you know, a potential expansion of the nuclear mission in Europe, despite all of these concerns and pressures from the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So I think I'll leave it there for now, and I'm excited to hear questions and all sorts of things.
Just thank you very much, Matt. I'm very interested in what you were talking about with the sort of the seesaw diplomacy between West German political leaders and the US about hosting nuclear weapons in Germany. Has there been, do we know what the public opinion of nuclear weapons are in sort of France and the UK, and like how those nations, like their people, feel towards holding like an arsenal of nuclear weapons? And also, I guess, like as a follow-up to that as well, have they also shared their nuclear weapons with NATO states, or has it only been solely the USA?
Excellent questions. I'll answer the second one first, which is they have not shared their nuclear weapons, right? France and the UK have their own national deterrence. And you know, in recent years, it's actually been really interesting to see how France has spoken about its nuclear deterrent, especially in the context of the Trump administration. This was happening a lot more often, but you could see, you know, President Macron, he would say every now and then, you know, he would make some kind of vague assertions about France needing to step up its strategic role in Europe since the United States was taking a step back. And he kind of proposed to open this dialogue with other European countries about expanding France's nuclear deterrent in some way. It wouldn't involve nuclear sharing, but perhaps like expanding what France would consider its vital interests in which they would, you know, use nuclear weapons. So that sort of thing. It doesn't seem really like his proposal has gotten much in the way of public support, but it was like a notable thing that people caught in his speech last year, where he said like, oh, we want to open this dialogue about, you know, expanding the role of our deterrent. So that's kind of an interesting little data point. With your first question about how people feel in those countries, there was actually a fantastic poll that was taken by the International Committee of the Red Cross. I think it was a year or two ago, and it was looking at millennials' views on war. So it was kind of a specific, you know, thing there, but they polled, I think it was pretty much every nuclear armed state, with the exception of, I think, ones that they didn't have access to. So I think like China and you know, North Korea and places like that. But what we kind of learned from that, because they had some questions about nuclear war, were that on the whole, you know, people that live in nuclear armed states, for the most part, are quite supportive of having nuclear weapons, which is interesting. And I get, you know, it does totally vary based on age, and there's like a class element to it as well, level of education, like those sorts of things. But, you know, especially in France, there is a real national identity tied to their nuclear deterrent. And there's kind of this, like a lot of people kind of joke in the nuclear field about how France will be the last country to disarm, because it's so tightly wound up in their national identity and relates to, having lost quote unquote, like lost an empire, and thinking about their nuclear deterrent as their way of kind of retaining this great power status, kind of similar to the UK, right? The UK, the only thing that makes the UK a great power, in as much as it even is its nuclear deterrent these days. Like the UK is otherwise, much more on, I would say, like Canada's level of kind of middle powerness, with the exception of the fact that they have about 225 nuclear weapons, which does really elevate them in this kind of great power realm. And I think to an extent, people feel that very personally there.
It's really interesting. Thank you.
Yes, Caesar.
Yes, thanks, Matt, and sorry to take the floor if anyone else has a question. Wonderful, I learned so much. Very, very cool. Just a couple of points. I mean, in the one, Matt alluded to this. I mean, the question of prestige, aside from any calculations or believe in nuclear deterrence or the role of nuclear weapons in security doctrines or collective security, stationing of there's this question of prestige, and it's in itself an obstacle, I think, on the path to nuclear abolition, because aside from any objective attributes, if there is such a thing, to nuclear possession, there's nuclear weapons possession, there's this question of prestige. And when in India and Pakistan, and there's videos on YouTube, these are like when they tested their first nuclear weapons, this is like scenes of jubilation in the street, just like a national holiday. We're playing with the big boys. I mean, this source of prestige, which again, it's a problem in itself, because it equates nuclear weapons with good things, whereas I think the opposite should be true, that the elimination is to advance collective security, etc. But there's this question of prestige. On the stationing of nuclear weapons, I mean, in the context of Ukraine, Belarus was making some legislative moves to allow the stationing of Russian nuclear weapons on the territory of Belarus. In Japan, some people started, including former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, started saying, you know what, Japan should get its own deterrent. We should get our own nuclear weapons. Some voices in South Korea, in public opinion, started saying, well, if we can't rely on the U.S. to protect us from the north, maybe we should have our own nuclear deterrent. So, just to say that this is also a bit of the fallout of when the salience of nuclear weapons seems to increase. You hear that chatter in some countries that otherwise would rely on U.S. protection about getting their own, so they don't have to rely on anyone by themselves, or something like that goes the logic. Luckily, not, this hasn't materialized. I think Belarus did authorize the stationing of Russian nuclear weapons, but in other places, it's sort of a bit worrying chatter about let's get our own as an ultimate guarantee.
All right, so if there's no further questions for Matt, I would say if there are, jump in right now. This is your chance to ask the great Matt Korda, pick his brain here. But if there's no further questions, then I think we're going to move to a 30-minute lunch break. So we're going to keep the room open, and feel free to leave and join back if that's what you would like to do. But we're going to keep the room open and then return back here at 12:35 Eastern time for a presentation by Erin Hunt of Minds Action Canada.